I think I finally figured out what's wrong with criminal justice. And no, it's probably not what you're expecting. Because if you ask 100 Americans what they want from the justice system, you'll get almost exactly the same answers every time. Safe neighborhoods, fair trials, victims treated with respect, criminals held accountable, innocent people protected, justice applied consistently. That's not exactly a controversial wish list. You could print those 6 bullet points on a campaign flyer and leave the candidate's name off, and every political party in America would point at it and say, yep, that's ours. Then they'd spend the next 6 months accusing each other of secretly opposing the Constitution and, for reasons I've never fully understood, hating puppies. Because apparently that's how politics works now. And that's the mystery. Not why we disagree, why we agree on so much and still keep building systems that almost everyone complains about. Last week I talked about what I called the issues that nobody owns. Those weird policy areas where Republicans, Democrats, and Libertarians all quietly admit, yeah, that's probably not great. Right before going back to yelling at each other on cable news about pronouns, gas stoves, or whatever the algorithm has decided we're supposed to be angry about this week. Criminal justice might be one of the biggest issues that nobody owns, which is honestly impressive because Congress is still leading in the lead of the category of institution most likely to make everyone simultaneously disappointed. Now, whenever criminal justice comes up, television usually gives us 2 choices. Option 1, lock everybody up. Option 2, nobody should ever go to jail. Meanwhile, the rest of America is sitting on the couch yelling, can we please try something, literally anything, between those 2? That's where I live politically. I'm a libertarian, which means I'm contractually obligated to ask the follow-up questions that make everybody at Thanksgiving suddenly interested in checking their phones. Questions like, what problem are we actually trying to solve? Or, how do we know if this worked? But my favorite question is the one that I think government forgets to ask more often than any other. Then what? Seriously, listen to almost any political speech. We passed the law! Great, then what? We increased the penalties. Okay, then what? We made it illegal. Fantastic. Then what? It's amazing how often government treats passing a law like Netflix treats the last season of your favorite show. Roll credits, problem solved. Except that's usually where the story actually starts. And to explain what I mean, I'd like you to spend one Tuesday with my friend Steve, because Steve is about to have a very long day. So meet Steve again. Steve isn't a politician. Steve didn't write the law. Steve wasn't on the committee. Steve didn't testify before the legislature. Steve has never once looked at a bill and thought, you know what this needs? Subsection G. Steve's just trying to get through Tuesday. Steve packs his lunch. Steve shows up to work 15 minutes early because that's what the employee handbook says to do. Steve has completed every mandatory online training module, even the one that somehow took 45 minutes to explain how to use a password. Steve owns a reflective safety vest that actually reflects. Steve has never once said, close enough. Steve is, in every possible sense, aggressively competent, which is exactly who you want working in government. Because here's something we forget. Government doesn't enforce itself. People do. Every law, every regulation, every policy eventually lands on somebody's desk, usually Steve's. Now, today the legislature has passed a brand new law. The press conference went great. Everybody smiled. There were flags, there were microphones. Somebody definitely said, this sends a strong message. Politicians love saying that. I don't know where the messages keep going, but apparently government sends a lot of them. Anyway, the law passes. Everybody applauds. Mission accomplished, right? Then what? Well, somebody violates the law. Then what? Steve gets the call. Now, Steve doesn't get to ask whether the law was a good idea. That meeting happened 6 months ago. Steve doesn't get to rewrite the statute. Steve gets the binder. Actually, Steve gets 3 binders, one for procedures, one for updated procedures, and one labeled Updated Procedures, version 17, final 2.pdf. Because no government office has ever truly deleted anything. Somewhere there's a filing cabinet containing instructions for a fax machine that was retired during the Clinton administration. But Steve follows the process, because that's what professionals do. He investigates, he documents, he collects evidence. Then what? Well, paperwork, obviously. Lots of paperwork. Then more paperwork explaining why there was paperwork. Because nothing says justice like a document explaining why another document needed to exist. Steve's superior reviews the paperwork, and then Steve has another online mandatory training about updated procedures for the paperwork. At one point, Steve has to enter the same information into 3 different computer systems that somehow still don't talk to each other. 2 rejected it, the 3rd accepted it, but only after Internet Explorer crashed somehow in 2026. Government may be enormous, but interoperability remains an ambitious stretch goal. Eventually, an arrest is made. The evening news reports it. Everyone feels like something happened. Case closed. Except, then what? The case moves through the courts. Attorneys negotiate. Judges rule. Jurors deliberate. There are more documents. Paperwork reproduces through what scientists believe is a form of administrative mitosis. At some point, everyone involved has a folder thick enough to qualify as a minor construction project. Eventually, a sentence is handed down. Justice has been served. Everyone goes home. Roll credits. Problem solved. Except, remember our question? Then what? Because here's the strange part. We spend years debating arrests, months debating trials, billions of dollars debating incarceration. And then people come home. And suddenly everybody acts like the movie ended before the final act. The person gets out. Then what? Can they find a job? Then what? Can they support themselves? Then what? Can they become the kind of neighbor we actually want living next door? Or did we just assume that once a person walks out of prison, the story somehow just writes itself? Because public safety isn't determined on sentencing day. It's determined 5 years later, 10 years later. Is the neighborhood actually safer? Did the victim receive justice? Did the person commit another crime? Did the system solve the problem, or did it merely complete the procedure? Those are very different questions. And once you start asking them, you start noticing something strange. We're incredibly good at measuring what happened. We're surprisingly bad at measuring whether it worked. And that's where the story starts getting interesting. Now, before anybody starts writing angry comments, let's get something out of the way. Consequences matter. Victims matter. Public safety matters. If somebody commits a crime, there should be consequences. That's not the debate. The debate is what happens after the consequence. Remember, then what? Because eventually, the sentence ends. Steve closes the file. The prison gate opens. Somebody walks back into the world. Then what? Well, they apply for a job. And that's where I want you to imagine something. Suppose every mistake you ever made at work became permanent. Not just a conversation with your boss, not just an additional training, not even a really awkward performance of you. Imagine every future employer received a copy of your permanent employee record, and it looked like this. Yes, it's in Comic Sans, because if we're going to ruin somebody's future, apparently we're going to do it with decorative fonts. Now, obviously, heating fish in the office microwave is a terrible decision. Some would argue unforgivable. Frankly, I think there's a support group for the coworkers. But here's my point. At what point does accountability become identity? Because those are 2 different things. Accountability says you did something wrong. Identity says this is who you are forever. And those are not the same sentence. Now let me be clear. This isn't about pretending the crime didn't happen. It did. Victims deserve justice. Communities deserve safety. None of that changes. But here's the uncomfortable question. If someone has completed the punishment that society has decided was appropriate, what outcome are we trying to create next? Because if the answer is, well, we're really not sure, then we're not actually managing a justice system. We're managing a process. And those are different things. And this distinction matters because a system can be extremely busy and still not be effective. A restaurant can have a full dining room and have terrible food. An airplane can leave the airport exactly on time and still have the wrong destination. And a government system can process thousands of cases while failing to answer the most important question. Did it work? But for some reason, that question is often the one we ask last, if we even ask it at all. See, Steve has started wondering about this too. Steve notices something. Steve keeps seeing the same people. Different Tuesday, same faces, same paperwork, same 3 computer systems that still refuse to acknowledge each other's existence. Eventually, Steve starts asking himself, are we solving problems or are we just getting really efficient at processing them? Because that's the difference between a process and an outcome. And here's where things get really interesting. Governments love scoreboards. how many arrests, how many prosecutions, how many convictions, how many cases closed. Those numbers are easy to count. Here's the problem. Easy to count isn't the same thing as important. Imagine judging a hospital this way. Great news, we've performed more surgeries than ever. Wonderful. Did more people recover? We don't actually measure that. Well, that seems like an important omission. Or imagine an airline proudly announcing, we had a record number of takeoffs this year. Fantastic. How many airplanes landed where they were supposed to? Well, that's really a different department. You'd probably stop flying that airline. But government sometimes makes the same mistake. We confuse motion with progress. We confuse activity with success. We celebrate that the machine is busy without asking whether it's producing the outcome we wanted in the first place. And once you notice that, you start seeing it everywhere, not just criminal justice, everywhere. Which means the real question isn't, is the system working hard? The real question is, what's on the scoreboard? Now, here's where my autistic brain does that thing it does. I notice patterns, usually about 5 minutes before everyone else says, And once you start looking at criminal justice through the lens of incentives, you can't stop seeing them. Because here's the really strange thing about systems. Systems don't actually care what you intended. They care what you reward. Businesses understand this. Teachers understand this. Parents definitely understand this. If you tell your kid, I'll give you $20 for every A on your report card, don't be surprised when they suddenly come home interested in finding the easiest classes. Congratulations. You didn't create a love of learning. You created a tiny economist. The kid isn't broken. The incentive worked exactly as it was designed to work. Government employees aren't any different. Steve isn't any different. Steve wakes up every morning genuinely trying to do a good job. The problem is somebody else decided what good job actually means. If Steve gets evaluated on arrests, Steve will make arrests. If prosecutors are evaluated on conviction rates, they'll pursue convictions. If agencies are rewarded for processing more cases, they'll process more cases. If prisons get funded based on occupancy, well, let's just say empty beds don't usually make a very compelling budget request. That isn't corruption, that's incentives, and incentives are incredibly powerful. In fact, they're so powerful they can quietly redefine what success looks like, which is how we end up with scoreboards that accidentally measure activity instead of outcomes. How many arrests? Easy to count. How many convictions? Easy to count. How many people passed through the system? Easy to count. How many forms did Steve complete before lunch? Honestly, probably too many. But here are the harder questions. Did the neighborhood become safer? Did victims receive justice? Did fewer people commit crimes 5 years later? Did someone successfully rebuild their life? Those are the questions that we actually care about. They're also the ones that take years to answer, and that's inconvenient. Because politicians love statistics they can announce before the next election. Outcomes are slow. Press conferences are fast. Now, before somebody clips that sentence out of context, I'm not saying that arrests don't matter. They do. Convictions matter. Sentences matter. Public safety absolutely matters. Those are necessary. They're just not sufficient. Imagine judging a football team entirely by how many plays they ran. We ran 87 plays today. Great, did you win? That feels unnecessarily negative. Or imagine a restaurant proudly announcing, we served more plates than ever before. Wonderful, how was the food? That's not one of our key performance indicators. You'd probably eat somewhere else. Activity is not the same thing as achievement. Motion is not the same thing as progress. And once you realize that, you start noticing something uncomfortable. Sometimes our debates aren't really about justice at all. They're about whose numbers look better on the scoreboard. Meanwhile, Steve is still filling out forms. The victim still wants closure. The neighborhood still wants to be safe. And taxpayers are still wondering, why are we spending more money every year while asking fewer questions about whether the system is actually accomplishing what we hired it to do? Maybe we've been keeping score all wrong. Now, if you've been following along, you might be thinking, okay, Darren, then what? Fair question. I've been asking it for the last 15 minutes. I probably owe you an answer. So here's mine. Before government asks for more money, more authority, more surveillance, more databases, more regulations, more penalties, or more power, I think it should answer one simple question. Can you demonstrate that the authority you already have is solving the problem that you promised to solve. That's it. That's the whole test. Notice what I didn't ask. I didn't ask whether the idea polls well. I didn't ask whether it sounds compassionate. I didn't ask whether it sounds tough. I didn't ask whether it fits neatly into somebody's campaign commercial. I asked one thing. Does it work? Because if we're going to expand government, we should know whether the current version is accomplishing the job we hired it to do. Otherwise, what exactly are we expanding? Think about it this way. Imagine taking your truck to the mechanic. You say, my brakes aren't working. The mechanic disappears into the garage for 3 hours. Finally, he comes back with a huge smile. I've got great news. We couldn't fix your brakes, but we'd like permission to redesign your steering. No, absolutely not. I appreciate the confidence. I appreciate the clipboard. I appreciate the embroidered polo shirt. I appreciate the complimentary coffee that somehow tastes like warm drywall. But before we redesign steering, maybe fix the thing I actually brought the truck in for. Government shouldn't get a different standard just because it has nice letterhead. Now, here's the part that surprises people. This isn't about criminal justice. It's about every public policy debate. Education, healthcare, housing, transportation, privacy, taxes. Pick an issue. Every one of them eventually comes back to the same questions. What problem are we trying to solve? How are we measuring success? What incentives are we creating? And then what? Because if we can't answer those questions, we're not really designing policy. We're conducting experiments on 8 million Texans without a control group. Now, this is usually where somebody says, so you're against government? No, I'm against skipping steps. I'm against confusing confidence with competence. I'm against expanding systems before we've taken an honest look at whether the current system is producing the outcomes we actually want. Government has legitimate responsibilities: protecting rights, keeping communities safe, resolving disputes, providing essential public services. Those responsibilities matter, which is exactly why they deserve serious evaluation, not blind trust, not blind cynicism, evaluation. Because every law eventually becomes somebody's Tuesday, usually Steve's. Steve doesn't get to ask whether the legislature measured the right thing. Steve doesn't get to redesign the incentives. Steve doesn't get to rewrite the law halfway through his shift because he notices it isn't working. Steve gets the binder. Steve gets the training. Steve gets the software update that somehow requires a password with 17 characters, a hieroglyph, and a blood of a unicorn. Steve just has to make it work, which means it's our job, before Steve ever gets involved, to ask whether we're building the kind of system we'd actually want someone else to enforce. Because once Steve gets the binder, the time for asking questions is mostly over. That's why we have to ask them now. So let's go back to where we started. Remember the mystery? Almost everyone wants the same things: safe neighborhoods, fair trials, victims treated with respect, criminals held accountable, innocent people protected, justice that's applied consistently. Republicans want those things. Democrats want those things. Libertarians want those things. Most Texans want those things. So maybe our biggest disagreements aren't always about where we're trying to go. Maybe they're about how carefully we're thinking before we start driving. Because over the last 20 minutes, we've followed one law from beginning to end. We watched politicians celebrate passing it. We watched Steve enforce it. We watched the courts process it. We watched someone serve their sentence. We watched them come home. And every step of the way, we kept asking the same question. Then what? Not because it's clever, not because it's catchy, because it's the question that forces us to think one step beyond the press conference, one step beyond the campaign slogan, one step beyond the applause. Because governing isn't measured by how exciting it sounds on announcement day. It's measured by what happens 5 years later, 10 years later, when nobody's holding a press conference anymore, when nobody's arguing on cable news anymore, when Steve is still showing up for work on a Tuesday. That's when we find out whether the system actually worked. You know, I think one of the biggest mistakes that we've made in politics is believing that every problem needs a bigger answer. Sometimes it just needs a better question. Questions like, what problem are we actually trying to solve? How will we know if we've solved it? What incentives are we creating? Who has to live with this decision? What happens if we're wrong? Those aren't partisan questions, those are governance questions. They're the kind of questions every citizen should ask, regardless of which party happens to be in charge. Because here's something I've learned: government isn't magic. It's just people. People writing laws, people enforcing laws, people trying to make sense of systems that other people designed. Which means good government doesn't begin with bigger promises, it begins with better thinking. It begins with recognizing that every law eventually becomes somebody's Tuesday, usually Steve's. Poor Steve. At this point, he's completed 14 online training courses, updated 3 passwords, entered the same case into 4 databases, and somewhere a printer is blinking paper jam even though there isn't any paper. Hang in there, Steve. We're trying to help. Because Steve deserves laws that make sense. Victims deserve justice that actually delivers justice. Communities deserve policies that make them genuinely safer. And taxpayers deserve to know that government measures success by outcomes, not just activity. Now, if you've watched this entire summer deep dive series, you've probably noticed a pattern. Every episode starts with a different topic: privacy, housing, healthcare, occupational licensing, property rights, criminal justice. But they all seem to end in the same place. Not with Republicans, not with Democrats, not even with Libertarians. They end with systems. Because systems outlive politicians. Systems outlive headlines. Systems outlive election cycles. And if we're building the wrong systems, good people inherit bad incentives. But if we build better systems, ordinary people can do extraordinary good, including Steve. Which brings me to why I'm running. I'm not running because I think I have every answer. Frankly, any candidate who tells you that they do should probably make you a little nervous. I'm running because I think government has become far too comfortable giving confident answers to questions that it never bothered to ask. Questions like, does this actually work? How do we know? Can we prove it? And then what? Because if we can't answer those questions, maybe we aren't ready to pass the law. Maybe we should slow down, ask one more question, measure one more outcome, think one more step ahead. Not because government shouldn't act, because when it does, real people have to live with the consequences. I'm Darren Hamilton, Libertarian candidate for Texas House District 57. I'm asking for your vote because I believe Texas deserves representatives who ask better questions before they write bigger laws. Not representatives who promise perfection, representatives who remember that every policy has consequences. Every incentive changes behavior. Every law becomes somebody's Tuesday. And every decision deserves one final question. Then what?